Video games are, okay, so the question is, can that sense of meaning be hijacked? And the answer to that is absolutely. Absolutely. Because you could say that the ultimate sense of meaning is composed of the union of fragmentary senses of meaning. And the fragmentary senses of meaning can be overwhelmingly powerful. Anger, sexual lust, and the sorts of things that you experience when you're playing a video game, which are very carefully calibrated to keep you on the edge of exploration, let's say. Now, I'm not a foe of video games, because games are complicated and it isn't clear what people are doing when they're playing them. They may be expanding their cognitive skills, they may be learning to cooperate, they may be learning to engage in complex problem solving. And so, but part of it's also a matter of balance. 50 hours a week, probably not, unless you're going to go pro, right? Because there's other things you need to be attending to. It's not a stable solution for you, your family, your society. It's too one-sided. Yeah, and you can get pulled down rabbit holes of all sorts that are one-sided pursuits of meaning. So, and it's something we're actually going to talk about as the later classes unfold. The question is, how do you stop yourself from falling prey to a pathologized sense of meaning? And I think one of the answers to that is, don't lie. Because what you're hoping is that your nervous system is sufficiently healthy and well programmed so that what it reads out to you is reliable. And if you pathologize your psyche by either through sins of omission, let's say, or outright deception, you're going to warp that internal structure and it's not going to read out properly to you. And then your sense of meaning will lead you astray. So like one of the reasons for speaking the truth, I shouldn't say that because you don't know how to speak the truth, but you do know how not to lie. And it's a game you're playing with yourself. You can define the damn lies. No one else has to do that for you. You try not to utter falsehoods because you warp your neurological structure by doing so, and then it will read out pathologically, and then if you rely on it to guide you, it will run you right off a cliff. So that's why there's a moral element to this, is if you're going to rely on your sense of meaning, make sure that you don't pollute the mechanism.
You don't want to play a video game where there are no rules.
Yeah.
And you don't want to play a video game where the rules transform so rapidly and erratically that there's no way you can model them. You want to play a video game where you can suspend disbelief. There's some play with the axioms, so maybe there's some things about the modeled reality that aren't exactly like real reality. But once that framework is established, once the rule-governed framework is established, there's play inside of it, and that's very engrossing. And I think part of the reason it's engrossing is, one, you actually learn things from playing games, because in some sense you're always playing a game, right? Because you're always inside a reality that's bounded by a certain set of assumptions. And it's not the total reality. It's like a game-like representation of the total reality. And, hopefully it's a good enough game-like representation. One of the things I was thinking about in relationship to video games was, I've read critiques of video games where people complain about young people generally being engaged in video games to the expense of having a real life. And then I was thinking, I don't know if you know about Edward, I think his name is Edward Castronova. Now he's an economist who studied video games. And he did this quite a while ago, I think it's got to be more than 10 years ago now. But he made the claim at that point that one of the big, massive online player games, I think it was World of Warcraft, but that might be wrong, was like the 20th largest economy in the world. Really? Not in any fake way, partly because you could sell artifacts that you were producing on eBay, for example, but also partly because people traded within it. And there was no reason to assume that the additional level of abstraction that video game represented was necessarily any more abstract than what we were already doing in economies. So then you could ask yourself, for example, think about this. Is it more real to lead a band of adventurers through a complex mythological reality in an online game, or to work at McDonald's? Now you'd say, well, to work at McDonald's because that's real, but let's think about that for a minute. So exactly why is it real? I mean, first of all, McDonald's couldn't exist unless it was nested in a whole bunch of other things, right? So it has to be nested in a functional capitalist economy, and that has to be nested inside a functional political system, and then there's all sorts of other preconditions in terms of material supply and so forth that have to be in place before you're able to work there and receive tokens for your labor. Okay, so the same thing applies to the video game. And you might say, well, how do you determine which of those is real? And I would say, well, maybe one of the ways of determining whether a game is real is to what degree do you practice a wide range of the subsets of skills that would be transferable to other games while you're playing that game. And I think you can make a case that if you're playing a very complex video game, that the activities that you're engaging in, which involve leadership and cooperation and communication and problem solving, are actually a more comprehensive subset of the skills that you would have to develop to work in the world as a complex place than what you would pick up at McDonald's. Now, you know, obviously you can argue about that, but it's not self-evident. So, and I think that's Horace, that noticing, that's the I. It's not thinking, because it's not the framing process. It's something outside of that. It's something that's watching. And I think if you notice, you'll see, if you go through your week, you'll notice, because you have to sort of stand outside yourself and think, aha, I was really into that. I was pulled right inside it. And then you see phenomena that occur along with that, which Csikszentmihalyi has detailed reasonably in his work on flow. You don't notice the passing of time. You're not self-conscious. And the activity is sustaining, you experience it as sustaining, even though it might be difficult. You know, so it's not a matter of just taking the easy way out and doing something fun. It's not that at all. Although it can be that. It's often you feel that way when you're doing something that's exceptionally challenging and difficult. And usually I think it's those things that they're real in relationship to your goal hierarchy. You know, so they're moving you forward in the way that you've determined that moving forward is appropriate, insofar as you've sorted that out. So, you know, A implies B, and B implies C, and C implies D, and so forth, and you've sorted that all out. You know, so maybe you're working on an essay in a class that you find meaningful because you want to derive something useful from your education so that you're a good citizen, so that you can live a proper life, you know. And so the chaining of all those things makes the local activity quite richly meaningful because it's properly contextualized. But then there's the other element, which is when you're pushing yourself beyond that, not only do you experience the meaning of what you're doing in relationship to your goal hierarchy, you also transcend the goal hierarchy at the same time, so that while you're working towards realizing it, you're also working towards transforming it and improving it. All at the same time. And I think that you're set up to experience that as the highest form of being. And then there's a corollary to that, which is maybe if you spent the bulk of your time doing that, you know, so you got practiced at it, so you were doing it, well, maybe I don't know, you can figure it out for yourself, but my suspicions are that for many of you, that's probably 5% of your weekly life. Maybe I'm wrong about that, because it's been a long time since I was your age. I can't remember what it was like, really, you know. But I do know, you know, when I survey undergraduates and I ask them how much time they waste, you know, they're telling me, generally speaking, it's 4 to 6 hours a day. And I actually think it's probably more than that. And so that's time not spent in this particular state of mind, you know. And it's wasted time. Well, you even recognize it as wasted time, because when someone asks you if it's wasted time, you say yes. And it's like, well, wasted, if it's wasted and you know it, you're obviously comparing that to some other sort of time that isn't wasted, right? That you regard as valuable and meaningful and worth engaging in, even though it might be difficult and require discipline and all those sorts of things. So you might ask yourself, you know, if you have times during the week where you're engaged enough in what you're doing so that you find that intrinsically meaningful and it removes the burden of tragedy, and I don't mean because you're preoccupied, I mean because you're experiencing what you're doing as intrinsically worth the price. That's a different thing. You might think, okay, well, what if you were in that state of mind 80% of the time, or 85% of the time, or 90% of the time? You know, and that requires a tremendous amount of discipline and organization and clarity of purpose, and it also requires a tremendous amount of truth. Because the enemy of setting yourself up so that you can do that is untruth. Because what happens is, to the degree that you engage in untruth, you contaminate your frames fundamentally. And then you're in real trouble. Because you won't be oriented properly if your frames are contaminated, and they're contaminated to the degree that you build them out of nonsense and delusion.